My name is Lila, and if you'd asked me a year ago what graduation would feel like, I never would have guessed it would start with a secret I'd carried my whole life. Graduation day had always been a distant dream, a finish line I wasn't sure I'd ever cross. As I stood in the crowded auditorium, the weight of my cap felt heavier than it should, pressing down on my thoughts. My heart pounded in my chest, not just from excitement, but from a familiar anxiety that always seemed to follow me when my family was near. I scanned the rows of seats, spotting my parents in the front, their faces lit with pride, and beside them my older sister Julia, her posture perfect, her smile practiced. The air buzzed with celebration, laughter, camera flashes, the scent of fresh flowers, but beneath it all, I felt a current of tension, a sense that something was about to go wrong. My hands trembled as I clutched my program, replaying every moment that had led me here. I tried to focus on the stage, on the promise of a new beginning, but my mind kept drifting back to my family, to the secrets we never spoke about, to the roles we played so well. Today was supposed to be about me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it would become about them. Growing up, my family revolved around Julia. She was the golden child, the one who seemed to shine without even trying. 3 years older, she was the benchmark for every achievement, the standard I was always measured against. Julia's report cards were framed and hung in the hallway. Her trophies lined the mantel, and her name was spoken with pride at every family gathering. My parents loved to tell stories about her, how she won the spelling bee in 3rd grade, how she was the youngest to make varsity, how she got into her dream college on a full scholarship. Every milestone she reached became a family celebration, a reason for my parents to beam and boast. I was the quiet one, the shadow trailing behind her light. My interests were different: art, writing, things that didn't come with medals or applause. When I brought home a painting that won 1st place at the county fair, my mom smiled and said, "That's nice, honey. Julia just got accepted into the honors program." It was always like that. My achievements were acknowledged but never celebrated. I learned early on that my role was to support, to applaud, to stay out of the way. At school, teachers would light up when they saw my last name, only to look disappointed when they realized I wasn't Julia. Friends' parents would ask if I was the smart one, too. Even at home, dinner conversations revolved around Julia's latest accomplishments, her plans, her future. I became an expert at fading into the background and making myself small so Julia could shine even brighter. My parents never meant to hurt me, or at least that's what I told myself. They were proud of Julia, and I understood why, but their pride in her cast a long shadow over me, one I could never quite step out of. I grew up believing that being second best was just my place in the family, and that no matter what I did, I would always be the supporting act in Julia's story. The ceremony moved along in a blur of names and applause, but my mind was anchored to the present by a growing sense of dread. When the dean announced a special message from my parents, I felt every muscle in my body tense. My mother and father stepped onto the stage, their faces glowing with pride, and I tried to steady my breath, hoping for a simple congratulations. Instead, my mother's voice rang out, clear and emotional as she began. "We are so proud of our daughter Leela, but we owe so much to Julia. She was more than a sister, she was a second mother. She helped raise Lila, kept her on track, and made sure she never felt alone." The words echoed through the auditorium, each one landing like a blow. I felt the eyes of hundreds of people turn toward me, then toward Julia, who sat with a modest smile, her cheeks flushed. My father added, "We're grateful to Julia for all she's done. Leela, you're lucky to have a sister like her." The applause that followed was thunderous, but I felt exposed, as if my own story had been rewritten in front of everyone. This was supposed to be my moment, my achievement, but once again, I was cast as the supporting character in Julia's narrative. The humiliation burned in my chest, and I realized in that instant that I couldn't let this version of my life be the one everyone remembered. As the applause faded, I sat frozen, my mind spinning back through years of memories that suddenly felt sharper, more painful. I remembered being 7, sitting at the kitchen table with a math worksheet I couldn't solve. Julia breezed in, glanced at the page, and explained it in seconds. When my parents came home, they praised her for helping me, never asking why I was struggling in the first place. It was always Julia who got the credit, Julia who was the hero, while my own efforts disappeared into the background. There were so many moments like that, times when I needed help, not because I was lazy or careless, but because I was overwhelmed. When I forgot my lunch, Julia shared hers, and my parents thanked her for being responsible. When I got sick and Julia brought me medicine, they called her nurturing. No one ever asked why I was so quiet, why I spent hours alone in my room, or why I flinched when voices were raised. The truth was, our family had secrets we never spoke about. My father's temper was unpredictable, a storm that could break at any moment. My mother coped by disappearing into her work, leaving Julia and me to fend for ourselves. Julia became my shield, stepping in when things got tense, smoothing over arguments, distracting me with stories or games. She was my protector, but she was also a child, forced into a role she never asked for. Our parents saw her as a savior, but I saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the way she'd retreat to her room and cry when she thought no one was listening. I learned to hide my own pain, to keep my head down and avoid drawing attention. If I did well in school, it was because Julia helped me. If I stayed out of trouble, it was because Julia set a good example. My struggles, my anxiety, my loneliness, my fear were invisible, overshadowed by the narrative my parents loved to tell. The secret we all kept was that Julia and I survived not because of our parents, but in spite of them. And now, as I sat in my cap and gown, I realized I was done letting that secret define me. When my name was finally called, I walked to the stage with my diploma in hand, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear the applause. I was supposed to smile, wave, and return to my seat, but instead I paused at the podium, gripping its edge as if it might steady me. The auditorium quieted, hundreds of faces turning my way, waiting for the usual words of gratitude. I took a shaky breath, feeling the weight of years pressing down on my shoulders. I want to thank everyone for being here today, I began, my voice trembling but clear. And I want to thank my professors, my friends, and yes, my family. But there's something I need to say, something I've never said out loud. A hush fell over the room. I glanced at Julia, who looked back at me with wide, uncertain eyes. My parents sat frozen, their smiles faltering. My parents just thanked my sister for raising me. And it's true, Julia did a lot for me, more than any sister should ever have to. She cooked, she cleaned, she helped me with homework. She was there when our parents weren't. But what no one knows is why she had to do all that. I paused, letting the silence stretch, feeling the tension ripple through the crowd. The truth is, our family wasn't perfect. My parents worked hard, but they also fought hard. There were nights when Julia and I hid in our room, listening to shouting downstairs. There were days when we took care of ourselves because no one else would. Julia didn't raise me because she wanted to play mom. She did it because she had to. Because we were scared, and because we only had each other. I looked at Julia, tears shining in her eyes. I want to thank Julia, not for raising me, but for surviving with me, for being my friend when I needed one most. And I want to say to my parents, I hope one day you'll see me for who I am. Not just Julia's little sister, but Lila, someone who worked hard, who overcame a lot, and who deserves to be seen. The silence was absolute. Then slowly applause began, soft at first, then swelling, filling the room with something that felt like release. As I stepped away from the podium, the applause echoed in my ears, but my focus narrowed to the faces of my family. My parents sat motionless, their expressions a mixture of shock and disbelief, as if they couldn't quite process what had just happened. My mother's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her lips pressed into a thin line. My father stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched, eyes darting between Julia and me. Julia, for the first time in years, looked vulnerable, her eyes glistening with tears, her shoulders trembling as she tried to compose herself. Around us, the crowd buzzed with whispers. I caught fragments. Did you know? That was brave. I had no idea, as people leaned in to share their reactions. Some looked at me with sympathy, others with admiration, and a few with discomfort, unsure how to respond to a truth so raw and unexpected. Walking back to my seat, my heart pounded with a strange mix of fear and relief. I had exposed the reality we'd all hidden for so long, and there was no taking it back. I felt exposed, but also lighter, as if a burden I'd carried for years had finally been set down. For the first time, I wasn't just Julia's little sister or my parents' afterthought. I was myself, heard and unafraid of the truth I'd spoken. In the days that followed, everything felt different. My parents grew quiet, unsure of how to approach me, their usual certainty replaced by hesitation. Julia reached out more than ever, our conversations finally honest, no longer weighed down by old roles or unspoken pain. For the first time, I felt a sense of freedom, a lightness that came from no longer hiding or shrinking myself to fit someone else's story. I realized I didn't need their approval to feel worthy. I had found my own voice and it was enough. The family dynamic shifted, subtle but real, as if my words had cracked open a window and let in fresh air. I started to see myself not as a shadow, but as someone who had survived, who had grown strong in the darkness. I was no longer invisible. I was finally fully myself. If you've ever felt overshadowed, silenced, or forced into a role that wasn't yours, know that your story matters. Speaking your truth can be terrifying, but it's also the first step toward freedom and self-acceptance. You are more than the labels others give you. You are the author of your own life. If this story resonated with you, I invite you to share your experience in the comments. Let's create a space where every voice is heard and every journey is valued. And if you want to hear more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and stay connected.